we stop recording. Okay, thank you.
Niels. Thank you, Niels, for the introduction, and thank you all for attending here today. So as the introduction noted, I have extensive interest in German and Chinese and intercultural philosophy. And so you'll see a little bit of that in the talk today. So I'll give a brief overview of the notion of acting without acting, wu-wei, and different interpretations, and also how they were taken up in the European context. And then I'll try to trace their implications or implications of certain interpretations of wu-wei in terms of our ecological and democratic practices in the contemporary world. And so in that light, I have a slightly different title that's a little bit more concrete about what I want to do. So I'll give you that now with the share screen. And so again, I'm going to be talking about acting without acting, this crucial notion that occurs in the early Daoist sources, such as the Daodejing and Zhuangzi. But also it should be noted, like the word Dao itself, the word wu-wei appears throughout various Chinese philosophical and religious traditions. And I'll note a few aspects of that in the lecture today as well. What I'm really interested in today is the implications for politics, beginning in the ancient Chinese context, what we might call following Foucault biopolitics, but also what are the implications for our contemporary participatory, ecological, and democratic politics in the contemporary world? Can we learn something from this ancient Chinese notion of wu-wei? And I want to argue, following a long line of various Chinese and European interpreters, that in fact we can and should learn something from wu-wei. Even if we don't want to become full Daoists, we can still, of course, learn things from this tradition that suggests a very powerful ethos for interacting with others, with things, and with the natural world as well. So first off, I just want to introduce, not to scare anyone, some basic Daoist expressions that we'll return to throughout the talk today, just to give you a compass about notions that I'll explain more fully as we go along. And the first expression is that of wu-wei itself. And it should be noted that it occurs in both forms, wei, wu-wei, which means acting without acting, or acting not acting. And that's put in a kind of contradictory way in which various forms of interpretation have developed to try to resolve that apparent contradiction, if it is one. And then the second, more shorter expression is simply wu-wei. And often they're translated slightly different into French, German, and English. And so when you see the expression doing nothing, inaction, as you frequently do in translations of the Daodejing or Zhuangzi, they're referring simply to wu-wei. Whereas when they use this more paradoxical formulation, they're referring to the entire expression, wei, wu-wei. And this notion in Daoism, early Daoism in particular, is connected with this Chinese notion of ziran. And in contemporary Chinese, that simply means nature in a very mundane and ordinary sense. That's how they translate the word nature into contemporary Chinese. But if you go back to the archaic roots of the word, how it is used in these early Daoist and other early Chinese sources, it's a much profounder word in many ways than just the mundane word nature. Because the word, if you break down the characters, means what is of itself so, or the self so, or what something is in and of itself. And usually in the early Chinese context, regardless of the tradition you're dealing with, it refers to how things are self-arising, self-patterning, self-generating. And of course, we're very tempted to use contemporary European biological notions such as autopoiesis, which I would do only in a very qualified way because it has a lot of differences between the Chinese notion of ziran and what contemporary biologists refer to as autopoiesis. And we can talk about that later if you want. Third, there's this notion of nourishing or nurturing life that is very pivotal in early Daoist sources, and then in later practical and religious applications of Daoism as well. Because in contemporary Chinese, yangsheng, nourishing life, simply means any kind of set of life practices like diet or exercise or meditation or Tai Chi and so on. But we also find this notion at work in early Daoist sources in a very profound way of how we interact with the things and the creatures around us. And finally, we should consider that the Chinese expression wanwu, the myriad things, refers not to mere physical items in the world, as we usually think with the English word thing or the German word ding, usually it's a non-human or a non-creature that we're referring to. But the notion of thing in ancient China refers to everything, including humans, creatures, including natural things, and including artifacts as well. And that's actually very crucial to avoid a misunderstanding, because often Daoism is thought to counterpose the natural thing and the artifact in a very radical way that ends up being fairly dualistic and very much a misinterpretation of what these early Daoist texts are trying to say. So let's turn now to the main key concept that we're going to discuss today, that of non-action, which is a more literal translation of wu-wei, or acting without acting. And again, we should note that it occurs throughout various Chinese philosophical transmissions. It's not only a Daoist concept, but it's also found in Confucianism, and where it usually refers, for instance, to moral exemplarity, that the sage or the emperor is an exemplar to others, and that's the emperor or sage's wu-wei, and not coercing others, but giving them an example to follow. But there's even an egotistical or egoist, yangist idea of wu-wei, and even a legalistic one as well, which is a kind of ancient Chinese thinking of power. So given this situation, we have to realize that there are multiple conflicting and contradictory interpretations of wu-wei, even in the Chinese tradition itself. And these range through a wide variety of different kinds of states. So for example, early modern European Jesuits and others translated wu-wei as inaction, quietude. But there are certain Chinese interpretations that correlate with that, because they see it as a kind of quietistic indifference and inaction as well. When one is in a state of acting without acting, one does not act at all. One simply is in a state of repose. But there are very different interpretations that we find in the classical Daoist sources. For example, one prominent interpretation that we find is that it means a kind of minimalism in action, how to achieve the maximum results from the minimum of action. And in fact, that's the sense of wu-wei that Han Feizi and the legalists, these thinkers of power, pick up, because they're very much concerned with how the emperor can rule through the minimal amount of coercion and law, and yet rule in a powerful and effective way. But we find a different sense of wu-wei in the Daodejing and the Zhuangzi, and then in later mysterious learning discourses, which is the one I want to emphasize and prioritize in our discussion today. And this is that wu-wei is a kind of resonance, a kind of responsiveness, even a kind of releasement in relationship to the things, creatures, and others around us. And so one is not acting, not in the sense of not doing anything whatsoever, but rather one is not coercing things. One is not pushing them in a way that violates what they are, but rather one is simply observing, tracing, and responding to how things behave, how they interact with you. And so this notion of wu-wei is actually correlated with another Chinese concept of responsive resonance. And this becomes very prominent in later Daoist interpretations. So let's next turn to three exemplars of wu-wei that we find in classical Daoist and some of the other sources as well. One is very clear, very evident in the Zhuangzi text. So we see various stories and narratives of hermits, of recluses, of various religious, poetic, and philosophical wanderers who go out to nature and exist in the natural world, embracing it while seemingly rejecting society. And actually, this notion of wu-wei is very historically and etymologically close to a set of expressions that come from the earliest form of Chinese religiosity, which is the kind of shamanistic sensibility. And this, of course, is something that Max Weber emphasizes in his interpretation of Daoism and his religions of China, that wu-wei is in fact a kind of charismatic possession by the spiritual world. And if you base yourself on the religious Daoist texts, it's clear how you can get such an interpretation. And all of this stems from the ancient shamanistic sense of giving oneself over to the spirits and forces of nature, that they possess you, and then you roam with them. So I do think that Weber's analysis is inadequate today, but it does have a point that the most archaic level of wu-wei is a kind of shamanistic possession by the spirits and natural forces and so on. And in the early poetic tradition that continues throughout the Chinese poetic tradition, in fact, is this notion of far roaming, And originally that was a kind of shamanistic roaming out in nature, encountering forces of nature and the spirit of trees and waters and so on. But later it becomes a kind of poetic form. So there's an entire poetic genre in Chinese literature of far roaming visions where the poet wanders in the natural world. So that, of course, is one sense of wu-wei that we find in the Chinese transmission. And this is the one where we can see it develop in the Zhuangzi in particular, because one of the primary notions we see in the Zhuangzi is of free and easy wandering. And that's a radical transformation of this earlier shamanistic visionary quest, I would say, made in a very philosophical way. And this is why the Zhuangzi has all these stories of recluses, hermits, and others, and so on. But there's another sense that we find very clearly in the Zhuangzi and the Leizi and a little bit in the Daodejing as well, which is this vision that some scholars have identified with an agrarian utopian tradition in Chinese thought, like Angus Graham has done that, the sinologist. And these are passages and chapters that concern themselves with simple, non-hierarchical, self-organizing agrarian communities that have no leaders at all. They simply are self-organizing. And this reappears in Confucian literature. For example, they're often meeting these crazy farmers doing things on their own, and the Confucians don't really appreciate this because it has no order, no hierarchy, no ruler, and so on. And then in the post-Han period, there's a whole transmission of these teachings that gets later interpreted as being anarchistic, a kind of anarchism. And that's a topic I'll return to later in the talk today. And then finally, we have the more paradigm model, I would say, especially in the Daodejing and in other early Daoist texts, and also in the Confucian texts in this different way, of an exemplary sage king or sages. And these are people who rule and devise through wu-wei, and they understand that either as Daoist self-ordering, that the best way to rule is not to rule, that the best king is the one who allows the people to flourish in their own terms, in their own ways, allows things to flourish in their own ways. And this is an interpretation that gets taken up in the early modern European reception of Daoism and Confucianism and is linked with the notion of laissez-faire, which is another topic I'll return to later. But notice that already there's a difference between how Daoists and Confucians understand this model of wu-wei of the sage king, because the Daoist one is supposed to rule through letting things organize themselves, whereas the Confucian is going to be a moral exemplar that inspires a moral pattern that helps people realize this kind of self-ordering for themselves in a moral way. So they're very different in how they understand the notion of wu-wei to work. And of course, the legalistic notion of wu-wei is very different because it's very cynical and power-oriented. So let's then talk about some contemporary interpretations to help situate what we're discussing here today. And I think we can find a number of ways of interpreting wu-wei and some of the problems associated with that throughout the Chinese tradition, and also contemporary European and Western and global interpretations as well. So one very common tendency, I think, since the 19th century among many Western interpreters and now contemporary Chinese interpreters as well, is to depoliticize and privatize the notion of wu-wei. So even though the Daodejing is clearly written for the sages and sage kings as a kind of model of behavior and practicing wu-wei, often it is read as a kind of spiritual guide to individual behavior. And so many interpretations emphasize how wu-wei is establishing a certain kind of psychological state of being in the flow, for example, is a very common expression that people use to explain what it is to be in this state of acting without acting. It is a kind of flow experience. We are kind of in the zone, to use one of those American expressions that people like to use. But of course, this is a very problematic tendency in my mind because it depoliticizes, it privatizes, and psychologizes the notion of wu-wei. And we see that not just in contemporary American and European interpretations. In fact, this begins in the 19th century with these mystical and psychological interpretations of wu-wei that we find in various German, English, and French translations of the 19th century. So for example, in the early 20th century, if you look at Richard Wilhelm, he reads wu-wei in terms of the unconscious as establishing a certain kind of psychological experience of the world in relationship to the unconscious self. That's a heavily individualistic, psychologistic way of understanding wu-wei. And this should be a problem for whether we can apply contemporary psychological individualistic ideas to this ancient Chinese concept and experience. And I think we at least have to be cautious. And I would suggest even more than that, that this is actually a wrong way of going about interpreting the notion of wu-wei. Secondly, we have to be concerned about different ideological and social political configurations and deployments of wu-wei as well. Because if you look throughout Chinese history, we'll note that wu-wei is not always an innocent concept. So for example, if you look at the legalistic use of wu-wei, or if you look at the more authoritarian Huang Lao Daoist political traditions that are concerned with establishing a cosmological order that is reflected in the king's political order, and these are correlated with each other, all of these can be interpreted in highly ideological ways. And maybe even the more beneficial or better senses of wu-wei have potential ideological uses as well. And thus we should keep that in mind as well. And my suggestion for today, of course, is not converting to Daoism, but rather learning from these Daoist sources in a critical way where we can begin to find critical models and exemplars for ourselves in our current ecological plight. And so to give one example of these kinds of problems, the Lao Tzu's, the Daodejing of Lao Tzu both justifies and problematizes the ruler in different passages. Sometimes certain passages have a more powerful sense of the ruler and what the ruler is doing. Other times the ruler is simply in the background, someone who seems almost unnecessary. And that later tendency will create this more kind of anarchistic side of the Daoist transmission that I'll talk about later. And likewise, we see different models in the Zhuangzi as well, that there are models of withdrawal from society into nature, wandering at free and at ease in the natural world, simply encountering and resonating and responding with things. And there are other models of agrarian simplicity. And the reason for this is most likely is that the Daodejing and the Zhuangzi are composite texts with multiple authors that were revised repeatedly throughout their histories. And of course, we do not know the prehistory of all the revisions that might have been involved. So in this case, then, we should begin to question maybe some of the contemporary readings of wu-wei that have become very prominent, especially in Western philosophical circles. And the one I want to address in particular, I think the psychological one is a problem, but I want to address the political one more directly. So many current approaches, as I mentioned, take this acting without acting as in a private individual mystical state, or somewhat better as an adaptive, flexible, reflexive knack in some kind of flow experience. And the reason why I want us to begin to question these kinds of interpretations, there are a lot of different versions that are very prevalent in contemporary interpretations, is that these seem to reflect a kind of isolated individual subject. They focus on psychology, and psychology is about an individual subject and what is going on in the individual subject's mind. And I would argue that this has more to do with our contemporary understanding of the self and its psychology than with these early Daoist sources. So if we go back to early Daoist sources, there's two very noticeable things. There's no prominent sense of the individual subject. Of course, they use the word I, war, right? There's a sense of the self, but it's a very different sense of the self than what we find in contemporary Western and intercultural sources. And even the supposedly ancient Chinese egotistical or egoist tradition associated with Yangju and Yangism, it is not egoism in the contemporary Western senses of this word, because Yangju is primarily concerned with preserving bodily integrity within the flow of things. He's not concerned with acquiring wealth, self-assertion, all the other things that we associate with modern Western egoism. So even the ancient Chinese egoist has a very different sensibility about what the self is that is being preserved. Namely, it is the bodily self, the body that is intermeshed, right, with the forces of nature. Secondly, we have to, it's easy to recognize, I think, with the Daodejing, although somehow it's often forgotten, And also, I think it's true of the Zhuangzi as well, even though it's a less prominent focus of the Zhuangzi, that these texts are directly ethical and political texts. So it's not enough to talk about a kind of mystical or psychological state. They're presenting ways of relating to oneself and the world and the things and creatures of the world. And so, for instance, with the Daodejing, we see that it directly concerns the art of rulership that makes up the majority of the text. And it's primarily concerned in most of those passages, not with the power of the ruler, but rather with the ways in which peoples and things can organize themselves. And of course, this is the correlation of the notion of non-acting wu-wei with this other Chinese concept that I mentioned earlier, ziran, which means the self-naturing, the self-so-ness of things. So in the early Daoist context, wu-wei always has to be correlated with ziran, and we have to realize that it's a full sensibility, it's a full ethos that concerns all of our relations, our very relational way of being, and thus not merely an isolated psychological self. And of course, in the Zhuangzi, beginning in the miscellaneous and outer chapters in particular, but then in the post-Han, Wei, Jin, mysterious learning sources, we see a kind of anti-politics develop. And this anti-politics has two different forms. One is the withdrawal model of going out into nature with yourself or a few colleagues and abandoning society. And the other is this model of a kind of so-called primitive agrarian simplicity. I think those are two critical models of how to relate to society and the political itself. So often this is read as or anti-political, but the anti-political can in fact be very political. This can be a political relation to one's own society when one says what society is doing is wrong, therefore I will withdraw into nature, or I will try to give models of a better way of life, such as these so-called primitive, egalitarian, agricultural communities that are kind of an ideal, maybe a utopian ideal throughout the Chinese tradition. And it's interesting that these ideas of primitive self-organizing communities occurs not only in the Daoist tradition, but also the Confucian tradition picks up on it as well. And so often later Confucians talk about the communal contract. And so you have a local political self-organization of a community coming from the bottom up, so to speak, alongside with this royal model where politics and ethics comes from the top down. And in fact, you might say Chinese history is a tension between these two models of spontaneous self-organization of the people from below, and then the power of the state, the government from above. And of course, this tension lives on in the current state of affairs as well. So the second problem then I want to introduce here is the problem of ideological appropriations of Daoism. And I want to contend here that they can be problematic even if they seem beneficial. And that's why when I talk about Daoism and the environment in my 2020 book, I kind of annoyed a number of Daoist environmental people who always think of Daoism as intrinsically green. The Chinese society has this intrinsic environmental character and so on, by saying we have to be more critical of these kinds of concepts, their political uses and so on, because often these can be ideologically appropriated, and also they don't always recognize the kind of interpretive variety that we see within the Chinese tradition itself. And so the problem here is that these political and ethical uses can take on ideological forms. So first we have to admit the interpretive variety that we see in the Daodejing, the Zhuangzi, then later mysterious learning, so-called neo-Daoist sources as well. Because in the modern West, and now interculturally and internationally as well, they've been described as kind of anarchistic agriculturalism, primitivism, laissez-faire libertarianism, socialism, anarchism, and so on. And so the question is, what is going on? Why do all these different European and intercultural political traditions appeal to the Daodejing, the Zhuangzi, and some later texts as well? I'll just give you a few examples of this. And there's a number of new articles that have come out on these interesting developments. So for example, in contemporary Europe, there are progressive green movements especially the Swedish Greens, are very renowned for appealing to Daoist ideas. I'm not sure about the German Greens. I've not been able to find any concrete connections on my own, but maybe some of you know better about this. But also European eco-fascists as well have appealed to Daoist sources. And of course, they both are interested in a similar issue. How can we develop a more ecological civilization or culture in relationship to present alienated industrial society? But they have very different models, right? Very different lessons they want to draw on it. The Green movement is progressive and democratic. They draw democratic and progressive lessons from Daoist sources, where of course eco-fascists draw eco-fascist stuff from Daoism in the way they read it. But this is not only a problem in contemporary Europe, it's an issue in the contemporary PRC as well, because people, the government and others, intellectuals have said, well, Daoism is a green philosophy. It is a green religion. It is proof, right, of the Chinese closeness to nature and their willingness to call what they now call ecological civilization, to cultivate and grow that in the contemporary world. So obviously this can have a beneficial role, right, if it's encouraging better, greener technologies and ways of life and so on. But also at the same time, it can take on ideological functions as well. So for example, there's been a lot of debate about this notion of ecological civilization and whether a Chinese authoritarian model of ecological civilization would be a kind of model for a kind of eco-authoritarian state of some kind that would simply legislate everything being green all the time in a way that contemporary democracies have been seen to not do as of yet. And so I think we have to be aware of all these kinds of ideological deployments that we see in ancient China and early modern European reception, but also in the contemporary world as well. And thus we have to be critical of our own stance towards these texts, not only philologically, but philosophically as well. And this is why in my 2020 book, I argue for what I call critical Daoism, that we just can't accept these claims at face value, but they have to be substantiated through a process of reflection, critique, and so on. And once we do that, I say there are still lessons that we can draw from this ziran wu-wei model of Daoism. As I argued in that book, that Daoism can teach us first a kind of radical relationality. I think this is very important. When I gave a similar talk to this a few months ago in Slovakia, actually, many people were trying to figure out a way to get to relationality from European philosophy. But it should be noted that Chinese and Buddhist philosophies actually begin from a kind of fact of relationality. So in that sense, they've done half the work that contemporary European thinkers are trying to still get to. That relationality is not the result of a long string of arguments, but is the basic presupposition from which our argumentation, our analysis can begin, which I think would be an improvement. Second, Daoism has this radical participatory sense of how we're involved in the world. So of course, if Daoism is merely quietism and inaction in that very passive sense, then maybe that could be ecological because we wouldn't do anything to harm anything, right? But I think that's an inadequate concept of the ecological. Rather, what we can draw from Daoism is the sense that we are always participants, not just in, say, society as in contemporary democratic theory, but we're participants in the entirety of nature and our natural environment and our local ecosystem with everything that we interact with. And so this is another sense of this relational self that Daoism has, that we are always interacting in a system of relations with other things, creatures, people, and so on. So this is not just a democracy of individual people, you might say, but a democracy of the myriad things itself that this is implying, if read in a contemporary way. And third, then, this means that we have to rethink our notion of freedom. That freedom does not simply belong to an individual subject, right? But it has to be a relationally understood concept of freedom that we develop in how we relate with others, with things, with our environment that we are within at one moment or another. So we are always embedded, always relational, and thus the self and freedom have to reflect this as well. And I think this gives us a very different sense of what freedom might be than the paradigmatic European models, Western models that I'll discuss a little bit later. So I just want to mention a couple earlier European interpretations that are connected with wu-wei, with acting without acting, just to give you a sense of how my interpretation relates to these earlier projects, which I think gets something of wu-wei, but also misinterpret it at the same time. So first, I just want to mention this problem of laissez-faire. So there are a number of people who say that wu-wei is the origin of the notion of laissez-faire, right? And of course, often wu-wei is interpreted in German thought as lassen and gelassen. We see that with Buber and Heidegger, for example. And in the French, that would be laissez, right? So it makes sense that there would be a connection. But I just want to mention here that the Quesnay and the French physiocrats were not directly understanding wu-wei as laissez-faire in that way, because they did not know Chinese and they were relying on the Jesuit sources and translations of Confucian texts. But from those texts, they gathered a sense of the wu-wei of Confucianism, which they then interpreted through this French idea, French expression, laissez-faire. And this is where the connection between laissez-faire and wu-wei comes from. It's actually a constructed one that's only indirectly made with the physiocrats and then becomes popularized in the 19th century, and then with certain later libertarian thinkers as well. And we can see why this happened because Quesnay was very enamored of the Chinese model of politics and government, as was Leibniz earlier. And it's interesting that Leibniz and Quesnay both emphasize not the despotism of the Chinese, the so-called Oriental despotism that many other thinkers identified as the essence of Chinese politics, the rule of the emperor, the rule of one, as Hegel said, but rather a kind of natural ordering of things, a kind of freedom that people had to determine themselves in a number of ways. And so this book by Quesnay called Despotism and the Despotism of China is actually not a defense of despotism, but a rejection of that idea, because he argues that the Chinese, based on these Confucian models of government and economics, are practicing a certain kind of laissez-faire, a laissez-passer, right? Letting things go, letting things pass. And this is the principle of all public power, according to Quesnay. And you can see how this correlates well with the Chinese, in this case, a certain kind of Confucian notion of wu-wei, we find, for example, associated with the model of Mencius, because policies should be emphasize simplicity and ease. They should unleash the agrarian productive forces of society from all sorts of different burdens. And then they should maximize results from minimal efforts. And in particular, they should allow the peasants, to maximize their own wealth through their own efforts. And in that case, the wealth of the kingdom and the king would flourish. And that's actually a very Mencian argument. So this kind of Confucian argument goes back to the Mencius, where Mencius argues how best to rule is by allowing the people to flourish. And that is this kind of Confucian model of wu-wei and how it is introduced into European thought through Quesnay and the physiocrats. It's also interesting that the other way of interpreting wu-wei in 18th century Europe and French philosophy and sinology and so on is associated with Buddhism, where wu-wei is taken simply as a kind of quietistic inaction. But it wasn't until the 19th century that people began to realize that Daoism was the philosophy of wu-wei, right, in a certain radical sense. And I want to mention one other historical episode now that might be helpful for our ways of thinking about wu-wei today. And so you probably have not heard of some of these people, but there's a very influential circle of naturalistic, neo-romantic literary theorists, Heinrich and Julius Hart in Berlin, made a very influential literary circle in Berlin around 1900. And Gustav Landauer, the anarchist, was a participant, and Martin Buber as well. And basically what they argued is that there's an agrarian anarchistic idea present in these early Daoist texts. So I think Julius Hart is one of the first intellectuals who makes a very strong argument, along with, actually, I have to say Tolstoy might have done it a few years earlier. But there are a number of thinkers like Oscar Wilde, Tolstoy, and Julius Hart who all connect Daoism with anarchism through this idea of a simple, egalitarian self-organization. And so this became a model that helped inspire some of the utopian and agrarian tendencies of socialism and anarchism during that period. And so that's where we see the connection of Daoism with this other European political philosophy. So we saw it connected with laissez-faire earlier, and here in these examples, we see it connected with anarchism as well. And we see that in particular, not with Landauer, but his friend Martin Buber. Buber actually translated the Zhuangzi from English into German, and he connected wu-wei in his works of this period with a kind of agrarian socialism. He linked the Daoist form of self-organization with agrarian socialism of a democratic kind that actually helped shape, for example, his writings on kibbutz socialism as well. And another very interesting interpretation of wu-wei in this period is found in Alfred Döblin's Die Drei Sprünge des Wanwu, which is a really fantastic novel if you've not read it. It's a reflection on the notion of wu-wei in relationship to violence, self-ordering, pacifism, and so on. That's part of this milieu as well. So just as Julius Hart and Martin Buber said, we can learn from wu-wei, although we have to do so from our own context, from our own experience. This is what I want to argue here today, that we need to do as well. We cannot simply believe what is presented to us, but we can critically appropriate and try to relate to our own experience what we find in these ancient texts. And so, for example, Julius Hart wrote in 1905 that the Tao's laughter is laughter from one who has wept. The confidence that it has comes from doubt, and its pure harmony or vision of pure harmony of a new world is born from anarchy, right? And so he connects this kind of notion of anarchy and harmony that is actually probably related to a passage in the Zhuangzi where in the total cacophony, the noise of the world, we actually can hear this kind of hidden order within it, this hidden relatedness. Likewise, Martin Buber in this 1928 lecture, China und uns, is also very interesting, because there he says the one teaching that we Europeans should learn from the non-European world is the Daoist teaching of wu-wei, that we are beginning to learn of in the most painful way, but which we, from that pain, need to experience how it can help us relate to others, of course, the I-thou relationship, but also to the natural world as well. So if you're interested, I would suggest that you look at these sources further because they're very interesting, although we don't have time to go into them further. So now I want to turn to the question of politics and wu-wei, first in the Chinese context, the classical Chinese context, and then relationship to our own. So we can say that there are three models of the political in the Daodejing. One, I think, very prevalent reading from China to Europe is that of a model of responsive sage kings and kings who rule through the self-ordering of things and people, right? And this can be understood as a kind of enlightened rule or some kind of libertarianism or anarchism or democracy and so on. But the implication we should think about here is what then would be the role of kind of ecological sageness or sageliness? Can we, or do we need ecological sages to help guide us to a more ecological culture in the world today? Second, we have these more legalistic and Lao Huang readings of the Daodejing, where we basically are concerned with a kind of way of maintaining and asserting power. Of course, this is associated with despotism. And this raises the question that, say, a number of eco-authoritarian thinkers from China and even Europe talk about a kind of eco-authoritarian society, a new green Leviathan that could help regulate the world for the sake of the survival of the human species. So those would be two possible models that could be drawn from these classical Chinese sources. But there's also a third one that I prefer. So I don't think the sage kings are the best way to go because we no longer want this notion of a king, although sagely figures could be important. Likewise, we don't want to turn to eco-authoritarianism because it has a number of problems. Even if it was bent on a total ecological culture, there's no guarantee that it could actually enact it due to the powers of the corruption of power, of bureaucracy, and so on, that Max Weber analyzed in the late 19th century, and that we saw led to the failure of, say, communism in Eastern Europe. So the third reading I'd like to talk about now for the remainder of our discussion is that of this Lao Tzu Zhuangzi reading that we also see in a number of post-Han Wei Jin era texts. such as the Liezi and Baozi. And basically what this suggests is a kind of anarchistic, understood in a certain way, self-ordering without rulers, without at least despotic rulers. And of course, this has been interpreted as anarchism, but I also have a problem with this expression that I'll talk about in a few minutes. And so I think this is a very powerful model because it says there's a need to let peoples, but not only people, right, as in democracy, but also things, also creatures, living forms, also environments or ecosystems establish their own self-organizing or auto-poetic equilibrium. So this is a primary lesson that we today can learn from these Daoist teachings. And of course, in terms of the political form, the political lesson, maybe we'd want a blend of the first and the third. Because of course, pure anarchism would be hard to establish in this way, but also we're worried about authoritarianism. But could we then develop a critical model of eco-democracy where our participation concerns not just democratic institutions and democratic public, which are crucial, but also our sense of participation in the natural world, that we too are participants in the world. Even though we might feel very alienated from that world, that doesn't mean that we're not participating in this currently alienated way. And so this would be a way of rethinking democracy in an ecological way that would also be less anthropocentric, which I think is a problem of many current models of democracy, say that associated with the Frankfurt School of Habermas and Hanneth, that don't take our relation with nature as seriously as they should, in my mind. So of course, in the Zhuangzi and Liezi, right, texts of this period, we see a number of different types of passages about what can be done. Withdrawal, as I mentioned, which suggests maybe a kind of negative individualistic model that might be correlated with negative freedom as it's understood in the liberal and libertarian tradition. This is why I think a number of libertarians think that Daoism is libertarian. But there are also these other passages of free and equal self-organizing agricultural communities, either with or without these sage leaders. And these, I would suggest, are models of a kind of relational freedom. So we might not want to take them as socialism or anarchism as earlier thinkers in the early 20th century did, but rather we need to reconsider them in terms of our relational freedom within society in relationship to others, but also within nature as self-ordering with all the things and systems of nature as well. And thus, I think from this, we can draw a third notion of freedom, not the negative liberty of liberalism or libertarianism, not the so-called positive liberty of republicanism and socialism and anarchism, but rather kind of participatory freedom, right, throughout all the relations that we're engaged in. And so this is how I would like to correct these previous interpretations, the one-sidedness of them. Although they all have some truth in how they're interpreting Daoism, I think they're not comprehensive enough in understanding the full relational character of what is happening within these Daoist teachings. I'm sorry. So of course, we can say this relies on different models of freedom that have their Western equivalents or correlates. We have the classical liberal and libertarian one, which I think does not get to the core of Daoism because it's overly individualistic, even for Yangism, Yangju. Likewise, Republican, socialist, anarchistic senses often have a sense of a determining collective subject of the people, right, as an agent. And I think this is problematic as well because ancient Daoism not only does not have a collective, not only does not have an individual subject, it doesn't have a collective subject either. There's no notion of the people as an agency. So rather we have a kind of what I would call relational individualism. With each individual, each thing has a certain kind of freedom or lack of freedom in its relations with others, things, other people, and so on. So to this degree, we need that fully relational sense of what freedom is, right? That doesn't presuppose this individual self associated with egoism and striving and possession and power, but likewise does not presuppose a collective subject either, which again would be another kind of despotism in relationship to how things can organize themselves. So if we do have a notion of a relational self and relational freedom, then things are seen as self-organizing, self-patterning, in how they interact with each other. And individuals in society have a similar character as well. And we can draw that conclusion because in classical Daoist sources, there's no radical distinction between the self-ordering of people and the self-ordering of things, because both have to be allowed to flourish in their own terms for them to nourish life. And so in this case, the most important thing for a ruler to do, whatever kind of ruler it is to nourish life by allowing the myriad things to flourish in their own terms. So again, you can argue, well, would this return us to a kind of libertarianism or anarchism? Possibly, but I think that is a different set of presuppositions, that it has to be fully relational and cannot require the sense of the subject and its purpose, right? That say laissez-faire capitalism has, or that socialistic anarchism has, and so on. So again, we have to be very critical of how we begin to appropriate these earlier sources, but they do have this kind of exemplary set of models or critical models that we can employ to help correct our current situation. And so I think, again, this brings us to the question of relationality. Now begin to draw a conclusion here. That relationality, right, is often seen in European philosophy as undermining freedom. If we were thoroughly relational, how then can we have autonomy? How then can we have freedom? Freedom means to have a distance between yourself and whatever relations you're involved in. And of course, this Daoist alternative implies a very different concept of freedom as always within the relation itself. The freedom is not apart from our relations, but how we engage in those relations. And this is precisely what acting without acting, wu-wei, is about. It's about how we comport ourselves responsively, co-resonantly with the things and people around us. So that is the model of relationality. And because we can do better or worse, so to speak, in how we relate to these things and others and so on, this means that our comportment, our way of responding, makes a difference. So there is a kind of ethos underlying this notion of wu-wei and ziran that we see in particular in the Zhuangzi, that we are thoroughly relational and yet we can find our freedom in that relationality. And of course, this is what Zhuangzi calls wandering, free, and at ease. And there are certain ways of interpreting Zhuangzi as being kind of fatalistic and deterministic. But another way that I incline towards is that it's a teaching of relational freedom, of finding freedom precisely in how one relates. So there are a lot of examples of this that we don't have time to discuss in detail. And so I think you see a kind of relational freedom in these agrarian, so-called primitivist passages throughout the Zhuangzi that have been analyzed at length by Angus Graham, the sinologist. So if you're interested, you can look further into this. But what they basically emphasize is kind of shared simplicity, self-sufficiency, and so on. And these are, again, things we cannot simply easily enact. We cannot all withdraw to the countryside and become agrarian, egalitarian farmers. But we can take this as a critical model for how we see our relationality with others in society and then with the natural world as well. And then what we need to do is how do we adopt, critically appropriate these kinds of models in the contemporary world with all of its complexity, social complexity, and technological complexity as well. And that's where I want to conclude, right? That we should reject overly dualistic interpretations of Daoism, because many people interpret early Daoism as opposing action and inaction, complexity and simplicity, culture and naturalness, hierarchical society and primitive equality, and so on. That's actually what much of the literature does. And this is totally wrong in my mind. I would argue because actually it's about inaction within action, the sense of responsiveness in action. It's about simplicity within complexity. It's about naturalness within the state of culture or civilization that one has. It's about realizing a certain kind of freedom and equality in relationship to the society in which one exists. Even if it has hierarchies and so on, that does not mean you need to relate to others in that hierarchical way, but you can do so in the free and easy equalizing way that the Zhuangzi talks about. And so wu-wei then is not simply a negation of wei, assertive, controlling action. It is about negating the assertiveness, the controllingness, and so on, but not negating action as such or per se. So instead of seeing it as a quietistic denial of action, it in fact is an embracing of action as thoroughly relational or resonant and responsive with others. So in conclusion then, right, we have these various models that we see in classical Chinese thought that have very different implications if we try to apply them today. We would have legalistic and wanwu versions of authoritarian sage kings, right? Which I think would be a very dangerous way to go because authoritarian leaders never deliver what they promise, as we all know, historically speaking. Likewise, even the enlightened sage kings model is something we could admire to a certain extent, we could hope for, or try to promote leaders that would be as sagely as possible. But again, you cannot simply rely on authority in that way to carry through in a democratic society or in a way that would be fundamentally ecological in the long run. Because as long as there are particular interests that prevent the realization of a more ecological way of life, that will be prevented through these structures of power and hierarchy, whether they're based in power or the market or other such forces. So the most powerful insight that Daoism, these early Daoist texts suggest then is this kind of model of participatory, self-organizing communities and of our relations with the world around us, not simply of human communities. And I think this is an important lesson that we can learn in trying to develop more ecologically responsive society and democracy at the same time. So I wish I had more time to speak, but of course we'll talk more in our discussion. And if you have any questions, feel free to answer. But basically my conclusion here today is that we can learn from this kind of ziran notion of nature and wu-wei as a kind of practice about how to be more ecological, how to be more democratic, how to be more self-organizing, which means allowing things to organize themselves rather than trying to coerce them and force them in ways that actually destroy their capacity to nourish life. Because we know from biological studies that most ecosystems can restore themselves over time on their own, often better than any human planning can do. And so what this means then is rather than simply plan ecological restoration, we have to be involved as participants with these natural beings themselves, allowing them to refurbish themselves, allow them to replant themselves and so on. And so there have been a number of studies of forests in Austria, for example, where forests that have been allowed to regrown in this kind of more Daoist way and kind of planned ecological restoration have had very different results. And often the less planning that involved nourishing the forest while not trying to over-organize it was more successful for creating a living forest than the intentionally planned purposive strategy. So again, I think this is something that we can learn from Daoism, that yes, we do need to help things. This is called nourishing life. And we nourish life by not thinking of ourselves as isolated individuals, but rather by participating in life. But nourishing life means that we don't simply try to control it, but we participate and allow things to flourish in their own sense, in their own terms. So thank you very much. And if you're interested, I have 2 books related to this topic. One is Daoism and Environmental Philosophy from 2020. And the other is coming out later this year at Bloomsbury, called Heidegger and Dao, Things, Nothingness, and Freedom. And there I engage with Heidegger's longtime engagement with Daoism, which is a really interesting part of Heidegger's philosophy, but also I provide a Daoist critique of Heidegger at the same time. So I think Heidegger gets 1/3 of him is very much on the right track in my mind, but many other things go deeply wrong. So of course, we always have to read Heidegger in a very critical way, given everything that went on in his thought. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Eric. This has been most interesting, very clear and thoroughly argued presentation. Thanks a lot. We do stop